It is a great pleasure for me to be here today and to make a presentation. I'll tell you a little bit more about why I was perhaps invited here, what the trigger for that was. I come from Berlin, and our headquarters is in Berlin. We do political consulting, but we also do corporate consulting. I actually am from this state of Lower Saxony, so I'm happy to be here. I'm from the Wendland area, if you're familiar with that, and I'm glad to give you a presentation on this. The reason for this is a study we conducted last year. You can download it. We were contracted by the Lower Saxony Alliance for Sustainability, which is a cooperative venture between the state government, economic associations, chambers, and unions to see where we are in terms of decarbonization in the economy in Lower Saxony. What have we got so far? What are the challenges? What are possible levers and options? And we put together this study last year. It was drawn up and published last year. It was handed over to the Minister of the Environment of Lower Saxony back then. And that was the kickoff to begin a deeper discussion here in Lower Saxony as to how to do this decarbonization and transformation. That's the general term that people use, transformation of the economy. We drew this up. It wasn't just us at Adelphi. We did it for the University of, together with the University of Hannover, the Institute for Economic Policy there. Professor Thomsen was the name of the professor there. Now, this is the study. You can download it if you wish. sustainabilityalliance.de, that's where you can find it. There were three goals. I actually already mentioned these. They wanted to know what the status is of the transformation, how much knowledge and what actions are needed here in the economy of Lower Saxony, what options do we have now. Then we looked at some details for two industries. I'll get back to that in my presentation. We looked at a number of industries actually. Where is the industry now in terms of structure, in terms of energy consumption, options for action, possibility for action with regard to decarbonization. Then we took the third step. The third goal is what are the overarching fields of action that should be addressed, and we deliberately also worded this for lawmakers. Last year there was a local or state legislature election, and we're now looking forward to seeing what direction the state is going to go. For those of you who aren't from Lower Saxony, I have some basic data about the state here. It's a lot of copy, a lot of text, but since it's so loud here, it's probably not such a bad idea. I think it's obvious that, well, if you know about Lower Saxony, you know that the state is characterized by the automotive industry and the steel industry, and also by agriculture, by farming. We have a high level of economic concentration in certain regions in Lower Saxony. Another thing we've got that we saw in this study, that's one of the findings, is that all in all, well, we are in a very central location where we have good access to the seas, different logistics possibilities and ports, and we're going to discuss these things today too, perhaps. We have had a look at the intensity of R&D. Compared to Germany as a whole, it's below average. It is focused really on clusters for automotive production, not so much for other things. If you look at the history then for the reduction of CO2 emissions in the economy in Lower Saxony, you will say that the basic prerequisites here are quite good. Basic conditions are very good because there's a possibility for renewable energy production here. Lower Saxony is a leader here, so there's huge potential if you look at this as a factor for a production site. Supply chains that are carbon-free and so on, this is something that could be a benefit. Now, before we looked at the industry in particular, we asked what the fundamentals of decarbonization were. The objectives for Lower Saxony are to be number one in climate protection in all of Germany, so it's quite ambitious. And in their climate strategy and climate law, they strengthen these targets as a reaction to the strengthening of the federal goals for climate protection. Mr. Vollstedt's already mentioned this, reduction by 62% by 2017, And by 2030, 65% reduction based on 1990. That was all in all, THG reduction. For the industry as a whole, that means 62% reduction compared to 2017. And then we asked, well, what does this mean in terms of required investments? We're often talking about very complex processes in industrial companies. How much investment is required? There are different estimates made. We took one from Professor Tom Krebs, and he calculated, looking at the federal level, Federal Republic of Germany, he said a total of 46 billion euros every year would be necessary to achieve climate targets. So for Lower Saxony, it's about 4 billion euros per year that would be required. And then we had to look at different transformation areas. And these transformation areas were for all areas we looked at. And the transformation areas, well, we took them from guideline studies. You're familiar with them. There are some from Aurora Energy Transition, from BDI, from Potsdam, PIC in Potsdam, and they cover, well, what is decarbonization paths, what do they look like in industry, and 5 different transformation areas can be identified. The first one is this, and I'll briefly go into some detail here. The heat transition in industry, you know that industrial processes require a high level of heat, for instance, for chemical processes, chemical reactions, but also forming, shaping processes, and also for medium and high temperature processes. You do have a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions from industry, about 60% as far as we know. So the study was last year, and so that means the data is a little bit old now. And we also know that even though this is very relevant, it's a major lever for change, nevertheless the share of renewable energies is quite low in process heat. It's about 6% if you look at covering the needs for process heat. Second transformation lever that is discussed in the guideline study is avoiding process emissions. About 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in industry come from chemical transition, chemical conversion, and direct industrial use of greenhouse gases. About 70% of the process emissions are accounted for by a narrowly defined set of industries: metalworking industry, mineral industry, and fundamental material industry, basic material industry. That's about 70%. They're responsible for about 70% of these process emissions. Another lever that was identified is energy efficiency. You're familiar with this. They talked about this at the very beginning of the discussion for environment protection and sustainability. The question is, well, if you can increase efficiency, that's one of the first things you should do. It should be a leading strategy. So if you look at these studies, one thing is quite clear. Transformation paths can only be followed and climate targets can only be reached if you significantly reduce the amount of energy consumed. Otherwise, it's not possible. And people assume that we probably will achieve an increase in efficiency if you look at the overall energy intensity. You'll have to have a reduction of about 2% per year to achieve our climate targets. Now, 2000 and 2015, it was about 1.3%, so it was substantially below that. Then point 4, a circular economy and resource efficiency. You probably feel like I do. In a company, there's no day that passes without some new project coming in with that's about the circular economy. It's one of the subjects of the day, I would say, of the hour even. And this is due to the fact that you've got to increase efficiency, but you've also got to look at how you can succeed in reducing the consumption of primary raw materials. And the circular economy is a main lever for achieving this, because generating primary raw materials means that a lot of CO2 will be emitted. And of course, there are many levers, in particular with regard to energy-intensive production: steels, plastic, aluminum, cement. There's a major need for having much more of a circular economy in these areas. Fifth and last point, generating hydrogen generation and infrastructure. Now, this was the most disputed. Look at different studies, and if you go through them and check, okay, where are the application possibilities for hydrogen, and how big or how small is the potential there? Well, you see that there's a wide range of variance. We looked at different studies, and well, different scenarios were covered there, and the amount of hydrogen was between 10 and 50% of energy. And it's a wide range, and as you know, there's a heated political discussion going on about this. So the question is, when can this be applied, and when does it make sense to use hydrogen? Can you use it, for instance, for high temperature processes in certain industries, for instance, steel generation, and then chemicals industry, transportation. You're familiar with these discussions. I won't delve into any detail there. We looked at different industries, different sectors. I won't go through all of them. I just brought two along by way of example. The selection of the industries was done together with other parties, the associations, the unions, the chambers, and so on. And we looked at the industries that are particularly relevant for the economy in Lower Saxony. Now, that is quite small to read, but I hope that you can still more or less recognize what we're talking about. We looked at 9 industries in particular, and each of them in a different way will be affected by this transformation. Now, you can break them down. There are clusters of 7 in manufacturing. We'll have a look at 2 of them, and then the energy industry and tradesmen. Now, the last one I mentioned, if you look at the need for transformation, it's necessary in tradesmen's companies and in Lower Saxony. Well, they are enablers of the transformation too, these trade companies. Now, I'd like to look at 2 industries in particular. Once again, you can download this. It's all in here. All of the industries are covered in what we call industry sheets. They're clustered together there. We had to look at this. What's the starting point, the economic starting point? What are the historical emissions and energy consumptions of the industries? What about the transformation requirements according to the transformation path that I was just talking about for Germany as a whole? And what are the special challenges and possible fields of action? Now, I'll begin with mechanical engineering. And I'll just go through here quickly. This, of course, is a relevant industry in Lower Saxony. It accounts for about 2.5% of the overall economic performance in Lower Saxony. There you see some key data on the right-hand side. We've got to say that in Lower Saxony, it is of above average importance. And most of you, of course, know that the structure of this industry is quite international. Companies that are international companies on the one hand, on the other hand, there are many SMEs, SME suppliers, a high share of exports. About 2/3 are exported, 2/3 of their products, and we also had a look at the R&D expenditures compared to Germany as a whole, and there it's actually slightly below the level in Germany as a whole. What about emissions and energy consumption? Well, here we've got to say, if you look at CO2 emissions, it's about, well, it's not a huge share of what you have in the economy in Lower Saxony. Even if you look at manufacturing as a whole, those are minor items, and it's basically the average you see in other states in Germany if you look at energy-related CO2 emissions. And we analyzed and showed that the energy purchase of the sector is very much electricity. About 55% of the energy required is covered by electricity. And we also looked at energy consumption, and this is for mechanical energy and ICT and lighting. Now, of course, you've got coal and natural gas that play a major role too. This is important if you look to the future. You might wonder what energy sources will be used. Well, we have in our process heat requirements. It's mostly medium and low temperature processes, and this might give you a hint about what type of energy sources you could use in the future and what energy source you could substitute for fossil fuels. So there's just a small share of high temperature processes. And for some industries, we have a high share of natural gas used, higher than the average in Germany. Now, what about transformation requirements and what are the challenges? One thing we notice in particular for Lower Saxony, and I think this applies to other states too, is that the data available isn't that good. So, if you're active in this industry as a mechanical engineering company, you don't have much orientation or guiding if you're looking for possible transformation paths in the industry. That's one point that we passed on. As I said, most of the energy required is covered by electricity. You could say, in other words, that there's a relatively low need for other transformation actions if you compare it to other industries. Now, one major lever is increasing in efficiency because a lot of cross-sectional technologies are used and there's a lot of potential for higher energy efficiency there. So that's a major lever that we identified. We're talking here about the building automation, energy management, intelligent control. We'll perhaps talk about this in the other presentations. And you could also say that building insulation and conversion of heating systems will play an above average role if you're looking at the need for transformation and energy efficiency. This is another subject that you can say for all industries, lack of skilled workers. The associations, the unions have all talked about this. This is a subject that is really talked about everywhere. It's not relevant here too much. Just going through these different bullet points. When I walked around the show, I noticed one thing. The role of mechanical engineering is an enabler for transformation. There's a huge significance for this, and the production of machinery is hugely important for this. That should be emphasized. Then I would like to have a look at possible fields of action, key fields of action that we identified. First of all, energy efficiency. One thing we can state is that the primary energy consumption of this industry has gone up substantially in the past few years. That's not too good, I have to say. But in order to achieve the ambitious climate targets in Lower Saxony, we've got to go completely in the other direction. And then I also said that one major lever will be the cross-sectional technologies, where you have a lot of potential for energy efficiency there. And then interior heating. There's a high level of, or high need for interior heating in the industry. That's a major lever. Now, there's information available for companies so that they can set things up better in their company, but there's room for improvement there too, in particular when it's about specific technologies. And then point 3, product and process innovation. Now, if you look at this, you could say, well, mechanical engineering, if they compare the requirements in other sectors, you see that there's a lot of potential here in terms of transportation and being an enabler of transformation. So a lot could be achieved if they go into product and process innovation. And then the second industry I'd like to talk about is metal production and processing. Here you have the structure of the industry. Now we looked at revenues and workforce here, average relevance for the state of Lower Saxony, and it's characterized by relatively big companies. And the lower tier suppliers are SMEs. It's a big industry. If you look at the different states, it's interesting because it's one of the industries in Lower Saxony with the lowest expenditures for R&D. If you look at other states like Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria, you see it's quite different there. It's interesting if you're looking at the potential of the state for the future. What about emissions and energy consumption? You can see that metal production and processing in Lower Saxony, if you compare it with other industries, accounts for about 70% of CO2 emissions. That's above the average in Germany as a whole. And also for primary energy consumption, they're slightly above average, about 1.5 percentage points above the average for Germany as a whole. And that's gone up since 2010. You can look at it the other way and say, okay, there's lots of potential there for improvement if you look at that industry. And we also know that primary energy consumption in the industry is driven to a great extent by fossil fuels. To give you an example of this, or to drill this down, well, if you look at the production of steel and iron, well, coal still last year accounted for more than 50% of energy used. That's quite a high level. About 13% of the energy required is covered by electricity. Now the question is, what are the processes behind that? Well, high temperature processes, about 18% of processes in this industry. If you go out of iron and metal, the situation is much more varied in terms of fuels. If you look at production of aluminum, that's more than 75% electricity based, so it's a completely different situation than for iron and other ferric metals. And then we could go on to the next chart. What about the required transformation? Well, we have to say that there are a lot of possibilities in the industry. One potential is how to substitute iron ore in blast furnace converters. There are special technologies for this, but they have a lot of potential. And there are numerous other processes too, energy-intensive processes, where you have to have a closer look at the details, but that hasn't been done yet.
What are the biggest challenges for the industry? And later I will also get back to that topic. We created the study when the Ukraine war started last year, in February, March last year. And I will also show you the current mood and atmosphere in the industry, but I can already give you some feedback from the industry. So what are the challenges and what are the limitations or obstacles to innovation? First, competition from Asia. Very cheap production, and then high energy and raw material prices. So the energy-intensive industries are limited by that when they ask the question where to invest in terms of innovation. Then excess capacities, and that is why there's a lot of pressure to export products. This is also seen by the market participants. And there's also weakness in terms of innovation in Germany. This is also a political topic. We have also seen this shift when analyzing the data, that there is this shift abroad. So if you're investing in production technologies, we are talking about long cycles and high costs associated with the industry. So what are the main recommendations and main fields of actions? Well, I've been talking for quite some time now. I'm just taking a look at the time. You said that I have enough time for my presentation, but there are still other speakers waiting. What are fields of action? First, the hydrogen infrastructure. This is a big field, and according to the current technological state of the art, we can say that the decarbonization of the industry can only be possible based on hydrogen. Salzgitter is already a place where people develop a hydrogen hub, and where the hydrogen technology is being tested. And we also need to take a look at the entire added value chain. Another buzzword is Salzgitter, because industrial clusters are also developing there. So you need to consider the entire added value chain, but also within the region. And we also have to get back to the questions of the circular economy. Another important central field of action that we discussed last year is decarbonizing heat processes, especially when we talk about high temperature requirements. Now, if I may, I would like to just skip those two items, and I would just like to show you these slides. Last year, the participants expressed their wish to get some feedback. As I said, we conducted the study when the war in Ukraine started. And last year and this year, And during the creation of the study, we realized that there is a change in the mood, in the atmosphere in the industry, and it was the wish of the participants to also get an up-to-date feedback, what's going on in Lower Saxony, also in terms of investment decisions. So people wanted to know how the mood changed. I hope that you can read it on the screen. So the basic idea was that companies have already decided to make an investment, and we asked them whether their decision has changed. So we asked companies whether they still wanted to invest. So again, this happened in March, April last year. There were high raw material prices, high energy prices, and we wanted to see the impact on their investment decisions. And of course, you can have different interpretations, but we actually came up with the conclusion or the interpretation, what you can see on the left-hand side. There are more investments in decarbonization technologies, but you also see fewer investments. So you can see that the crisis is an accelerator on the one hand, and it's also inhibiting things a little bit. So you can see that this is a momentum or a dynamic situation in the industry, and you can see that reflected in the study. We asked the companies what are the main reasons why you decide to make an investment or why you want to delay an investment, and you can see the reasons over here on the screen. But the general statement was that there's a lot of uncertainty. People didn't know whether the political framework would change, whether the prices would change. So this was a reason for change in both directions, actually. More investments or even fewer investments. And the same is true for inflation and also long-term prospects and developments. And now, finally, I would also like to touch upon some recommendations for actions that we published. I don't want to present all of them in detail, so I just show you the study here. You can just read all the recommendations for actions in the study. We had 6 overall actions for recommendation, and one recommendation is to accelerate transformation. And that's quite obvious if you take a look at the industry. There are already investment activities going on. And if you also take a look at the ambition of the federal government, but also of the state government of Lower Saxony in terms of decarbonization, you have to say that transformation needs to be accelerated. Of course, this is just a general statement, but this statement can be applied to all different industries. And from our consultancy work that we provide or do every day, I can already tell you that we have to support the companies. We have to tell them what is the highest benefit of using decarbonization technologies, because there is a lot of uncertainty in the industry, and you need to support the companies, and you also need to define the benefit very clearly. And I just want to mention one recommendation for action. You can see that on the right-hand side in the middle. You need to consider the change in the labor market, and this is also shown in Lower Saxony. There is a huge demand. For instance, we have the new geothermal heat pumps that need to be installed. Who is going to install them? You need a lot of technicians for that. So this is a huge topic. We need new skills. We need new competencies. I will skip the other recommendations for action. You can read those recommendations in the study. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.